The summer of 1976 arrived in California's Central Valley like a slow exhale of heat and dust. Chowchilla was a small town, barely 15,000 souls, scattered across farmland that stretched toward horizons, blurred by shimmering heat. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency, and rumors traveled faster than the afternoon wind that rolled through the almond orchards. July 14th. Thursday, the last day of summer school. Dairyland Elementary sat at the edge of town, a cluster of pale buildings surrounded by chain-link fence and brittle grass turned golden by the relentless sun. Inside, 26 children, ages 5 to 14, shuffled through their final hours of multiplication tables and reading comprehension, their minds already drifting toward freedom. Swimming pools, bicycles, long afternoons with nothing to do but exist. The bus driver, Ed Ray, checked his watch. 3:15. He'd been driving school routes for 31 years. Knew every pothole on Avenue 21, every stop sign that leaned slightly left, every house where a dog would bark as the bus rumbled past. Ed was 55 years old, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a quiet manner that made children feel safe. He wore the same denim shirt every Thursday, ate lunch at the same diner every morning, lived alone in a house his father had built in predictable, reliable, forgettable. Outside, the bus number 48, painted that particular shade of yellow that seemed designed to absorb every ray of California sunshine, sat idling in the parking lot, engine ticking, heat waves rising from its metal roof. The children began to file out. First came the little ones, brothers and sisters holding hands, backpacks bouncing, laughter that echoed off the pavement. Then the middle schoolers, trying to look bored, trying to look older than they were, trying to pretend they weren't excited about 2 months of freedom stretching ahead like an unopened gift. Jennifer Martinez was 8, dark braids, gap-toothed smile. She clutched a drawing she'd made that morning. A house, a tree, a sun with rays like spokes on a wheel. Her mother worked at the cannery. Her father was somewhere in Fresno, though nobody talked about that. Monica Lewis was 12, already tall for her age, already carrying herself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to be invisible. She sat in the back of the bus, always, looked out the window, counted the telephone poles as they passed. The Ramirez twins, Carlos and Miguel, were 10. Identical except for a scar above Carlos's left eyebrow, earned falling from a tractor tire the previous summer. They spoke in a language only they understood, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at jokes that existed in the space between words. 26 children. Ed Ray counted them as they climbed aboard. Always counted. Never left until the count was right. 3:22. The bus pulled out of the parking lot, turning onto Avenue 21, heading north toward the scattered homes and farms where these children lived. The road stretched straight and empty, fields on either side, dust devils spinning in distant corners. The sky overhead was that particular shade of blue that exists only in the Central Valley in summer, endless, cloudless, hot enough to make the air shimmer. Inside the bus, the children talked and laughed and argued over who would sit where. Jennifer showed her drawing to anyone who would look. The Ramirez twins played a hand-slapping game that involved complicated rules nobody else understood. Monica stared out the window, watching the landscape slide past, thinking about nothing and everything. Ed Ray drove with one hand on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He didn't notice the white van parked on the shoulder half a mile up. Didn't notice it pull out behind them. Didn't notice the second van ahead, stopped in the middle of the road, hazard lights blinking, until it was too late. In a house 12 miles away, Frederick Woods sat at the kitchen table, smoking a cigarette, staring at a map spread across the Formica surface. 24 years old, tall, thin, restless energy that made him drum his fingers constantly, made his leg bounce, made him pace rooms like a caged animal. He came from money. His father owned a construction company. Acres of land, investments that generated income while other men broke their backs in fields. But Frederick wanted more, always more. He'd dropped out of 2 colleges, started businesses that folded within months, borrowed money he never repaid, told lies that became tangled with other lies until he couldn't remember which stories were true and which were inventions designed to make him seem larger, more important, more dangerous than he actually was. 2 other men sat with him. James Schonfeld, 25, thick-set, with a beard that made him look older, meaner. He'd known Frederick since childhood, played in the same little league, attended the same schools, shared the same restless dissatisfaction with ordinary life. James worked construction with his father's company, but his eyes held something darker, a hunger that went beyond paychecks and predictable futures. Richard Schonfeld, 22. James's younger brother, quieter, careful, the kind of person who thought through consequences while the other 2 charged ahead. He didn't smoke, didn't drink much, but he was there, at that table, looking at that map, because family was family and brothers followed brothers into whatever darkness waited ahead. Frederick tapped the map with his finger. "Here," he said, "Avenue 21. Bus route. Same time every day." "We've been over this," Richard said. His voice carried doubt like a weight. "And we'll go over it again." Frederick's eyes were bright, feverish. 3 of us, 2 vans, block the road. Simple. "Kidnapping 26 kids is not simple," Richard said. "Kidnapping 26 kids," Frederick said slowly, "is the perfect crime. Think about it. Nobody expects it. Nobody's prepared for it. We take them. We hide them. We ask for $5 million. The state pays. We disappear. And if they don't pay?" James asked. Frederick smiled. The kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "They'll pay," he said. The plan had been months in the making. Frederick had purchased a defunct moving van from a junkyard in San Jose, painted it white, removed the seats in the back, installed ventilation slits that wouldn't be visible from the outside. He'd drawn diagrams, made lists, calculated every variable with the obsessive focus of someone who'd finally found a purpose. James had stolen tools from construction sites, rope, chains, padlocks, things that could restrain without causing permanent harm, things that would work. Richard had scouted locations, driven the bus routes, timed the schedules. He kept notebooks filled with observations written in neat, careful handwriting that looked like homework assignments. Times, dates, number of children, pattern they'd practiced. Not the kidnapping itself that would be chaos, improvisation, adrenaline, but the afterward, the hiding place. Frederick's father owned property in Livermore, 40 miles north, a quarry, long abandoned, with equipment rusting under the sun and buildings that hadn't been entered in years. Underground, buried beneath tons of earth, was a moving van, an enormous metal box that Frederick had outfitted like a tomb. Mattresses, water jugs, bread, batteries, flashlights, enough to keep 26 children and 1 bus driver alive for several days while ransom negotiations proceeded. Enough to make the crime seem serious without crossing the line into murder. At least, that's what Frederick told the others. Evening settled over Chowchilla like a blanket. In houses throughout town, parents prepared dinner, set tables, called children in from playing. The Martinez family ate in front of a television that showed the news. Something about the bicentennial celebrations, something about a presidential campaign, something about drought conditions and water rationing. Jennifer's mother, Rosa, worked the evening shift at the cannery. She kissed her daughter's forehead, reminded her to lock the doors, promised to be home by midnight. Jennifer nodded, already half asleep on the couch, the drawing she'd made earlier lying crumpled on the floor. Monica's father, Gerald, was a mechanic. His hands were permanently stained with grease, his knuckles scarred from encounters with stubborn bolts and unforgiving machinery. He was a quiet man, prone to long silences, but he loved his daughter with a fierce protectiveness that sometimes frightened her. At dinner, he asked about school. She answered in monosyllables. They ate in silence. The Ramirez twins lived with their grandmother after their parents had returned to Mexico the previous year. She spoke little English. They spoke little Spanish. Communication happened through gestures, through shared meals, through the unspoken understanding that family was complicated, but necessary. That night, she made tamales. They ate on the porch, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to black. Ed Ray sat in his living room drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, watching the same television news that played in a dozen other houses. He didn't really see it. His mind was elsewhere, on the road, on tomorrow's route, on the same thoughts he'd had for 31 years. Safe, predictable, ordinary. He finished his coffee, turned off the television, went to bed. The clock on his nightstand read 9:43. Frederick couldn't sleep. He stood on the porch of his father's house, smoking cigarettes, staring into the darkness beyond the property line. Behind him, through the screen door, he could hear his father snoring. The old man drank himself unconscious most nights. Hadn't asked Frederick what he did with his days, hadn't noticed the vans parked behind the barn, hadn't cared. Tomorrow, Frederick thought. Tomorrow everything changes. He'd spent his entire life feeling like he was waiting for something, some opportunity, some moment when the universe would recognize his potential and reward him accordingly. But opportunities didn't arrive on silver platters. They had to be created, seized, taken by force if necessary. $5 million, split 3 ways that was still enough to disappear, to start over somewhere else, to become someone different. He crushed the cigarette under his boot, went inside, lay in bed, staring at the ceiling until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the curtains. July 15th, Friday. The day arrived hot and cloudless, identical to the day before. And the day before that, at Dairyland Elementary, the children filed into their classrooms one final time. The teachers had given up on actual learning. Instead, they showed films on projectors that clicked and whirred, distributed treats, saved for special occasions, signed yearbooks with messages about having a wonderful summer. Jennifer Martinez wore her favorite dress, white with yellow flowers. She'd argued with her mother about it that morning, insisting it was special enough for the last day of school. Even though her mother worried she'd ruin it playing outside, Rosa had relented. She always did. Monica wore jeans and a t-shirt that had belonged to her older cousin. She sat in the back of the classroom, drawing in the margins of her notebook, faces, buildings, abstract patterns that meant nothing and everything. The Ramirez twins were inseparable, as always. They sat side by side, whispering in their private language, occasionally erupting into laughter that made the teacher smile despite herself. 3 o'clock approached. The final bell rang with a sound that seemed louder than usual, as if the building itself was celebrating the arrival of summer. The children poured into the parking lot, their voices rising in a chorus of excitement and relief. Parents waited in cars, older siblings on bicycles, and there, idling by the curb, was bus number 48. Ed Ray stood beside it, checking his clipboard, counting children as they approached. One by one, they climbed aboard. Jennifer, Monica, Carlos and Miguel. 26 children in total. Ed counted twice, made sure every child was accounted for. Closed the door. 3:15. He pulled out of the parking lot, turning onto Avenue 21, following the same route he'd driven 10,000 times before. The sun beat down on the yellow roof. Heat waves rose from the asphalt. And up ahead, barely visible through the shimmering air, 2 white vans waited. Frederick sat behind the wheel of the first van, parked in the middle of Avenue 21. His heart hammered in his chest. His hands were slick with sweat. He'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. But now that it was happening, now that the yellow bus was actually approaching, growing larger in his rearview mirror, fear threatened to overwhelm him. Too late to stop. Too late to change course. Behind him, in the second van, James and Richard waited. The plan was simple. Block the road. Force the bus to stop. Threaten the driver. Transfer the children to the vans. Drive to the quarry. Simple. Frederick watched the bus approach. 200 yards. 150. The bus began to slow. Ed Ray frowned, seeing the white van stopped in the middle of the road. He eased off the accelerator, letting the bus coast to a halt about 30 feet behind the obstruction. He leaned forward, squinting. The van's hazard lights were on. Maybe a breakdown. Maybe someone needing help. He reached for the door handle, and that's when the second van pulled up behind the bus, boxing it in. Everything happened fast. 3 men emerged from the vans, wearing pantyhose pulled over their faces, grotesque masks that distorted their features into something inhuman. They carried shotguns, old pump actions that looked more threatening than they probably were, but the children didn't know that. Frederick yanked open the bus door. "Out," he shouted. His voice was muffled by the pantyhose, high-pitched with adrenaline. "Everybody out, now." Ed Ray stood slowly, raising his hands. "Easy," he said. "These are children. Just easy." "Shut up. Move." Behind Ed, the children sat frozen. Some began to cry. Others stared in shocked silence. Jennifer clutched her drawing, crumpling it in her small fists. Monica pressed herself against the window, her mind racing through impossible escape scenarios. James appeared at the emergency exit in the back of the bus, shotgun leveled. "Everybody to the front van," he barked. "Single file. Nobody runs. Nobody screams." The children moved like sleepwalkers, down the bus steps, into the scorching afternoon heat, toward the open doors of the first van. Ed Ray followed, his hands still raised, his mind calculating. 26 children, 3 armed men, no visible help, no cars on the road, just fields and heat and the terrible arithmetic of impossible situations. One by one, the children climbed into the back of the van. It was dark inside, hot. The metal walls radiated heat like an oven. There was barely enough space for everyone. They pressed together, small bodies against small bodies, fear radiating like a living thing. Jennifer was crying now, soft hiccuping sobs. Monica held her hand. The Ramirez twins stood together, silent, their faces pale beneath their summer tans. Ed Ray was the last to enter. The doors slammed shut. Locks clicked. Darkness. Total. Complete. Suffocating. And then the van began to move. Inside, the children clung to each other. Some sobbed. Others were silent. A few prayed in whispered Spanish. The darkness was absolute. The ventilation slits let in air but no light. The temperature climbed. 90 degrees. 100. The metal walls absorbed the afternoon sun, turning the interior into a furnace. Jennifer felt like she couldn't breathe. The air was thick, heavy, tasting of sweat and fear, and metal. She wanted her mother, wanted to be home, wanted this to be a nightmare she could wake up from. Beside her, Monica's voice cut through the chaos. "Everybody stay calm," she said. Her voice was steady, though her hands shook. "We're going to be okay. Just stay calm." Ed Ray pressed against the back wall, couldn't see anything but felt the children around him, felt their fear like a physical force. He'd been in Korea, seen combat, survived things he never talked about. But this was different. These were children, innocent, terrified. His job was to protect them, and he'd failed. The van drove for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Turns, stops, the hiss of air brakes. Voices outside, muffled and indistinct. Then more driving. The road surface changed. Smooth asphalt gave way to rough gravel. Then dirt. The van bounced and jolted, throwing the children against each other, against the metal walls. Finally, silence. The engine shut off. Footsteps outside. The doors opened. Blinding sunlight flooded in, making the children squint and shield their eyes. Frederick stood silhouetted against the brightness, his pantyhose mask even more grotesque in the harsh light. "Out," he said. They stumbled into the open air. They were in a quarry, a massive excavation surrounded by steep walls of earth and rock. Equipment rusted nearby. A crane with a broken arm, dump trucks with flat tires, and there, partially buried in the ground, was another van, much larger, with a hatch on top, standing open like a mouth. Frederick gestured toward it with the shotgun. "Down," he said. "All of you." A ladder led into darkness. Ed Ray descended first, then helped the children down one by one. The space below was bigger than the first van, but still cramped. Mattresses lined the floor. Water jugs sat in one corner. Loaves of bread in plastic bags. Batteries. Flashlights. A tomb prepared with care. When the last child was inside, Frederick appeared at the top of the ladder. He looked down at them, 26 children and one old bus driver, all staring up with faces full of fear and confusion and desperate hope. "Stay quiet," Frederick said. "Don't try anything stupid. We'll be back." Then he was gone. The hatch closed. Locks engaged with metallic clicks that echoed in the confined space. And then, worst of all, they heard the sound of dirt being poured on top of the van. Tons of it, burying them, sealing them in darkness beneath the earth. Someone screamed. The sound bounced off the metal walls, multiplying, becoming a chorus of terror that gradually dissolved into sobbing. Ed Ray found a flashlight, turned it on. The weak beam illuminated frightened faces. "Listen to me," he said. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who'd survived worse. "We're going to get through this. All of us. Together." Monica looked at him. "How?" Ed Ray didn't have an answer, but he smiled anyway. "We'll figure it out," he said. Above ground, Frederick, James and Richard stood beside the buried van, breathing hard, covered in dirt and sweat. "It's done," James said. Frederick nodded. His hands were shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a hollow feeling, a sense of unreality. They'd actually done it. 26 children. $5 million. He looked at the mound of dirt covering the van, barely visible beneath the displaced earth. Somewhere beneath that soil, those children were waiting, trusting that someone would come for them, trusting that this nightmare would end. Frederick crushed those thoughts, climbed into the van, started the engine, and drove away. The town of Chowchilla began to realize something was wrong at exactly 4:47 in the afternoon. Rosa Martinez stood at the end of her driveway, shading her eyes against the sun, staring down the empty street where the bus should have appeared 20 minutes ago. Her shift at the cannery started at 5. Jennifer knew the routine. Come straight home, lock the door, don't open it for anyone. Simple, but the street remained empty. No yellow bus, no laughing children spilling onto sidewalks. Just heat waves rising from asphalt. Silence broken only by the distant hum of irrigation systems in the almond orchards. Rosa checked her watch again, felt the first cold thread of worry wind through her stomach. Something was wrong. By 5:15, phones across Chowchilla began to ring. Parents calling the school. The school calling parents. Voices tight with confusion that was rapidly crystallizing into fear. Where was the bus? Where were the children? Had there been an accident? A breakdown? Anything? Frank Martinez, owner of Martinez Hardware on Main Street, received the call from his wife at 5:23. He left immediately, the store's door swinging open behind him, the little bell above it still ringing as he climbed into his truck. Gerald Lewis, elbow deep in the engine of a Ford pickup, heard his phone ring inside the shop office. He wiped his hands on a rag that only spread the grease around and answered. His wife's voice was high, thin. Monica hadn't come home. The bus never arrived. All across town, the same conversation repeated itself. Where are the children? Where is bus 48? Where is Ed Ray? The Chowchilla Police Department occupied a small building on 5th Street, wedged between a feed store and a barber shop that had closed 3 years ago. Chief Jim Stevens was 52 years old, a career lawman who'd never dealt with anything more serious than bar fights and the occasional domestic disturbance. His phone rang at 5:37. "Chief, we got a situation." Officer Mark Torres sounded breathless. "School bus didn't complete its route. 26 kids missing. Driver missing. No sign of the bus." Stevens felt ice flood his veins. "Send every available unit to search the route. Alert the highway patrol. And get me the superintendent on the phone." He hung up, stared at the wall. 26 children didn't just vanish. Buses didn't disappear. There had to be an explanation, an accident, a breakdown in some remote location where nobody had found them yet. But even as he thought it, Stevens knew. This was something else, something worse. The search began immediately. Police cruisers raced along Avenue 21, their lights flashing, radios crackling with urgent voices. They checked ditches, side roads, anywhere a bus might have veered off course. Highway patrol dispatched helicopters that circled overhead, their rotors beating the air, their searchlights probing the landscape even as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Parents gathered at the school, at the police station, anywhere they might get information. Their faces were pale. Their voices rose in waves, questions, accusations, prayers. Frank Martinez grabbed Officer Torres by the shirt, demanding answers the young officer didn't have. "Where's my daughter? Where are the kids? What happened?" Torres gently removed the man's hands. "We're doing everything we can, sir. Please, let us work." But there was nothing to work with. No bus, no children, no Ed Ray. Just an empty stretch of highway baking under the evening sun and the growing, terrible certainty that something unthinkable had occurred. At 6:45, they found the first evidence. A deputy spotted tracks, fresh tire marks leading off Avenue 21 onto a dirt road that serviced irrigation equipment. He followed them for half a mile until they ended at an abandoned field. There, partially hidden in tall weeds, sat bus number 48. Empty. The door was open. The engine was cold. Inside, backpacks lay scattered across the seats. Textbooks. Lunchboxes. Jennifer Martinez's drawing, crumpled and forgotten on the floor near the driver's seat. But no children. No Ed Ray. No sign of struggle except the terrible absence of 27 human beings who should have been there. The deputy radioed it in. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Found the bus. Avenue 21, half-mile east of Road 16. No passengers. Repeat, no passengers." Chief Stevens arrived within minutes, followed by a convoy of police vehicles, parent cars, and news vans that had somehow already caught wind of the story. He stood in the doorway of the bus, looking at the empty seats, the abandoned belongings, the small shoes lined up near the emergency exit. 26 pairs. Children's shoes. Stevens had 3 children of his own. He imagined them on this bus, imagined their fear, and suddenly the ice in his veins turned to fire. "Roadblocks," he barked. "Every highway out of the county. Alert FBI. This is a kidnapping. Multiple victims. Federal jurisdiction. Move." Beneath tons of earth, in a darkness so complete, it felt solid. 26 children and 1 bus driver fought to stay alive. The air was thick, heavy. Each breath felt like drowning. The temperature inside the buried van had to be over 100 degrees. The children's clothes were soaked with sweat. Some had stopped crying. Others hadn't started. They sat in small clusters, holding each other, too frightened to speak, too terrified to think about what came next. Jennifer had wet herself. She was ashamed, but couldn't help it. The darkness was too big, too heavy. She kept thinking about her mother, about missing dinner, about whether she'd ever see sunlight again. Monica sat with her back against the metal wall, arms wrapped around 2 younger children, who'd gravitated toward her natural authority. Her mind was racing. They'd been buried. That much was obvious from the sound of dirt falling, the absolute darkness, the way sounds didn't travel right anymore. Underground, in a box, with limited air. The math was simple and terrible. They were going to die here, unless they found a way out. Ed Ray moved through the darkness, using the flashlight sparingly to conserve batteries, checking on each child, offering water from the jugs. Quiet words of reassurance he didn't feel. Some responded. Others just stared with blank, shocked eyes. The Ramirez twins sat together, silent, their hands clasped. They hadn't spoken since the doors closed. Hadn't cried, hadn't moved except to breathe. Carlos's thumb traced the scar above his eyebrow, over and over, a nervous habit. "Mr. Ray," Monica's voice cut through the darkness. "We need to get out. I know, now, the air's getting bad." Ed knew she was right. He could feel it, that heaviness, that thickness. Carbon dioxide building up, oxygen depleting. They had hours, maybe less. He aimed the flashlight at the ceiling of the van. The hatch where they'd been lowered in was sealed tight, covered by tons of dirt. Even if they could somehow open it, they'd be buried instantly. But there toward the front of the van, a metal panel, part of the original truck's cab, welded to the cargo area. It looked different from the walls, weaker. "Maybe." "Help me," Ed said. Monica joined him, then several older boys. They pushed against the panel. It didn't move. They pushed harder. Nothing. Ed examined it with the flashlight. Bolts, welded seams. But near the top, a section that looked less secure. Rust around the edges. Deterioration. A weakness. "Tools," he said. "Anything metal, anything we can use as a lever." The children searched the van. One of the water jugs had a metal handle. Someone found a flashlight with a heavy base. Monica took off her belt. Not much, but the buckle was solid. Ed wedged the jug handle into a gap near the top of the panel. Pushed, pulled, levered with all his weight. The metal groaned. Didn't give. He tried again. And again. Sweat poured down his face. His hands were bleeding from gripping the makeshift tool. But slowly, so slowly, it was almost imperceptible. The panel began to bend. "Together," Ed gasped. "On 3. 1, 2. They pushed. The panel shrieked, bent further, and suddenly gave way, peeling back with a sound like a scream, revealing a narrow opening into the truck's cab. Ed aimed the flashlight through the gap. The cab was filled with dirt. The kidnappers had poured it through the windshield, probably thinking it would seal them in completely, but they'd miscalculated. The steering wheel had prevented the dirt from completely filling the space. There was a gap, small, maybe 3 feet of air between the dirt and the roof, and above that, Ed's heart leaped. He could see cracks of light, faint, distant, but light. They weren't as deep as he'd thought. "We're digging out," he said. Above ground, as night fell over the quarry, Frederick sat in his father's kitchen, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle. He'd done it. They'd actually done it. The children were secure, hidden, safe enough to survive a few days while the ransom was arranged. The news was probably going crazy right now. Police searching everywhere except the one place they'd never think to look. $5 million. Freedom. A new life. The phone rang. Frederick ignored it. Took another drink. His hands had finally stopped shaking. James and Richard had gone home hours ago, nervous and jumpy but convinced the plan had worked. They'd meet tomorrow to discuss the ransom note, how to deliver it, where to collect the money, details. But for now, Frederick just sat in the kitchen drinking, trying not to think about 26 children buried in the ground, trying not to imagine their faces, their fear. They'd be fine. He'd made sure of it. Water, food, air vents. They'd be fine. He took another drink. At the Chowchilla police station, organized chaos reigned. FBI agents had arrived from Sacramento at 8 p.m., taking over the investigation with the efficient brutality of federal authority. Special Agent William Parker, a man in his early 40s with silver hair and eyes like chips of granite, commandeered Chief Stevens's office and began issuing orders. Timeline. I want every movement of that bus documented. Witness statements. Anyone who saw anything unusual, and get me a list of everyone with access to that route. Maintenance workers, utility companies, anyone. Officer Torres spread maps across a conference table. Bus left the school at 3:15. Should have completed the route by 4:30. Parents started calling at 4:47. We found the abandoned bus at 6:45. 3.5 hours, Parker said. They took the children somewhere in that window, somewhere close, somewhere they felt confident wouldn't be discovered. We've set up roadblocks, Stevens said. Searched every building within 10 miles. Nothing. Parker turned to face him. Chief, whoever did this planned it, meticulously. They knew the route, the timing. They had vehicles capable of transporting 27 people. This wasn't random. This wasn't spontaneous. So what are we looking for? Multiple suspects. At least 2. Probably 3. Access to isolated property. Financial motive. They'll ask for ransom. As if on cue, the phone rang. Everyone in the room froze. Stevens picked it up. Chowchilla police. Silence on the other end. Breathing. Then a voice, male, distorted like someone speaking through cloth. The children are safe. For now. Wait for instructions. Click. The line went dead. Parker grabbed the phone. Trace that. Already on it, Torres said. But they all knew it was useless. The call had lasted less than 10 seconds. Not nearly enough time. But it confirmed what Parker already suspected. This was a ransom kidnapping. The largest in American history. And somewhere, 26 children were running out of time. In the buried van, Ed Ray and the older children had been digging for 3 hours, using their hands, pieces of metal, anything that could move dirt. They'd crawled through the opening into the truck's cab and were slowly, painfully, excavating upward through the soil that had been dumped on top of the van. It was like digging through concrete. The dirt was packed tight, heavy. Every handful they scooped away was immediately replaced by more sliding down from above. But Ed kept going, kept digging, because stopping meant dying. Monica worked beside him. Her fingers were raw, bleeding, but she didn't stop. Behind her, the Ramirez twins created a human chain, passing dirt back into the cargo area where younger children piled it against the walls. Jennifer had stopped crying. Now she just sat, numb, staring at nothing. Her white dress with yellow flowers was black with dirt and sweat. "I see sky," one of the older boys gasped. Everyone stopped. Ed aimed the flashlight upward. There, through the dirt, through the windshield frame, a tiny circle of stars, distant, impossibly beautiful. They dug faster. The hole widened. Dirt cascaded down, getting in their mouths, their eyes, but they kept going. The circle of sky grew, large enough for a hand, an arm, a head. Ed Ray pulled himself through first. He emerged into the night air like a man resurrected, gasping, sobbing. The stars overhead were so bright they hurt. The air was cool, clean, impossibly sweet. Behind him, children began to emerge, one by one, covered in dirt, exhausted, traumatized beyond anything they could articulate, but alive. All 26. They stood in the quarry, under the vast California sky, and for a long moment nobody spoke. They just breathed, just existed, just held each other and wept with relief and residual terror. Ed Ray counted them. Again, 26. Everyone. "Where are we?" Monica asked. Ed looked around. The quarry was unfamiliar, dark, but in the distance, maybe 2 miles away, he could see lights, a town, civilization. "Doesn't matter," he said. "We're getting help." They started walking, At 11:43 p.m., a security guard at the rock quarry materials yard in Livermore was making his rounds when he saw them. At first he thought he was hallucinating. Children, dozens of them, filthy, stumbling, led by an older man who looked like he'd crawled out of a grave. He ran to meet them. "What? Who are you?" Ed Ray's voice was hoarse. "Call the police. We're from Chowchilla. We were kidnapped." The guard stared. Comprehension dawned slowly. Then all at once, his face went white. He'd heard about it on the news. The missing bus. The children. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Get inside, all of you, now." He led them to the security office, a small building with fluorescent lights that seemed blindingly bright after 16 hours of darkness. The children collapsed onto chairs, onto the floor. Anywhere they could sit. The guard grabbed his radio with shaking hands. "This is Livermore Rock Quarry. I need police. Ambulances. I have the missing children from Chowchilla. Repeat, I have the missing children. All of them." The response was instantaneous. Police cars descended on the quarry within minutes. Ambulances, fire trucks. News helicopters appeared overhead despite the late hour, their spotlights turning night into day. FBI agents arrived in black SUVs, led by Special Agent Parker, who'd been coordinating the search from Chowchilla when the call came through. He entered the security office and stopped. 26 children. One bus driver. Alive. Against every statistical probability. Against every historical precedent for mass kidnappings. Against all reasonable expectation. Alive. Parker's throat tightened. He'd worked kidnapping cases for 15 years, knew the numbers, knew that after the first 24 hours, the chances of recovery dropped to nearly zero, knew that cases involving multiple victims almost never ended well. But here they were. Mr. Ray Parker's voice was gentle. Ed looked up. His face was gray with exhaustion and dirt. His hands were wrapped in makeshift bandages from the guard's first aid kit. But his eyes were clear. "That's me. Can you tell me what happened?" Ed nodded and began to speak. He described the white vans blocking the road, the men in pantyhose masks, the guns, being forced into the back of the van, the hours of driving, the descent into the buried vehicle, the terrible darkness, the decision to dig, the long hours of excavation. Parker recorded every word, his expression never changing, though inside he was calculating. Multiple suspects, elaborate planning, the buried van that showed sophistication, resources, access to heavy equipment. "The quarry where you were held," Parker said. "Did you see anything that might identify who owns it?" "There were signs," Monica spoke up. Everyone turned to look at her. "When we were walking to find help, I saw a sign near the entrance. It said Woods Construction and Development." Parker's eyes sharpened. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." By 2 a.m., every law enforcement agency in California had the name. Woods Construction and Development. Owned by one Frederick Newhall Woods III. Property holdings included the abandoned quarry in Livermore, where the children had been held. Current residents, rural Portola Valley, 30 miles south. Parker assembled a tactical team. "We move at dawn," he said. "I want the house surrounded. Nobody in or out. If these suspects feel cornered, they might run, or worse." But as the agents prepared, a call came through from the Alameda County Sheriff's Department. "Agent Parker, we may have your suspects. Traffic stop on Highway 84. 3 males in a white van matching the description. Pulled them over for a broken taillight." Parker's pulse quickened. "Hold them. We're on our way." Frederick had been driving aimlessly for hours. He couldn't go home, couldn't face his father, couldn't sit still while his mind replayed everything that had happened. James and Richard were in the van with him, equally restless, equally unable to process what they'd done. The plan had been perfect, was still perfect. The children were secure. The ransom note was written, sitting in Frederick's pocket, ready to be delivered tomorrow morning. $5 million. Freedom. Except Frederick couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. He'd called the police, disguised his voice, told them the children were safe. That had been stupid, he realized now. Unnecessarily risky, but he'd felt compelled to do it, to reassure himself that this was still a kidnapping, not murder, that the line hadn't been crossed. The police lights appeared in his rearview mirror, so suddenly he almost didn't register them. "Shit," James said from the passenger seat. "Stay calm," Frederick said. "It's just a traffic stop. They don't know anything." But his hands were shaking as he pulled over. The officer who approached the van was young, nervous. He'd heard the descriptions on the radio. Multiple white vans, 3 male suspects, but those were probably all over California. This was probably nothing, just a broken taillight. "License and registration," he said. Frederick handed them over. His license showed his real name. Woods. Frederick Newhall Woods III. The officer's eyes widened slightly. He'd heard that name, recently, in a briefing about property holdings connected to the kidnapping investigation. He stepped back from the van, his hand moving to his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle. All of you. Keep your hands visible." "What's this about?" Frederick tried to sound confused. "Innocent. Just step out, sir." They complied. Stood in the beam of the patrol car's headlights while the officer called for backup, his voice tight with barely controlled excitement. "This is Unit 7. I need assistance on Highway 84. I may have the kidnapping suspects." Frederick felt his legs go weak. Richard looked at him, eyes wide with panic. James stood very still, his face expressionless, but Frederick could see his brother's hands were trembling. It was over. By dawn, Frederick Woods, James Schoenfeld, and Richard Schoenfeld were in custody at the Alameda County Jail. They'd been separated, interrogated individually. Each of them broke within hours. Frederick went first. Once he started talking, he couldn't stop. The months of planning, the purchase of the vans, the construction of the buried prison, the careful surveillance of the bus route. He spoke with a strange mixture of pride and horror, as if he couldn't quite believe he'd actually done it. "We weren't going to hurt them," he said. His voice was hollow. "We just wanted the money. We made sure they had air, water, food. It was supposed to be safe." Agent Parker sat across from him, his expression carved from stone. "You buried 26 children alive. You sealed them underground with tons of dirt. They could have suffocated, could have died of heat exhaustion, could have been crushed, and you're telling me you weren't going to hurt them." Frederick's face crumpled. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "How was it supposed to happen?" "We were going to ask for ransom, $5 million. The state would pay. We'd tell you where they were. Everyone would be fine, except they escaped on their own, dug themselves out. A 55-year-old bus driver and a group of traumatized children saved themselves. No thanks to you." Frederick put his head in his hands. James Schoenfeld's interrogation was shorter. He confirmed everything Frederick had said, added details about the construction of the buried van, the timeline, the division of responsibilities. He showed no remorse, just a tired acceptance that he'd been caught. Richard was different, he cried, kept saying he'd known it was wrong, that he'd tried to talk them out of it, that he'd only gone along because of family loyalty. Whether that was true or legal strategy, Parker couldn't tell, didn't particularly care. By noon, all 3 had been formally charged. 26 counts of kidnapping, 26 counts of false imprisonment, 1 count of kidnapping a bus driver. Numerous additional charges that would be added as the investigation continued. The bail was set at $5 million each, the same amount they'd hoped to ransom. In hospitals throughout Alameda County, 26 children were being examined, treated, and reunited with their families. The physical injuries were relatively minor: dehydration, exhaustion, cuts and abrasions from digging. But the psychological trauma would last much longer. Jennifer Martinez clung to her mother and wouldn't let go. Rosa held her daughter, rocking her, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep, that it was over, that she was safe, that nothing like this would ever happen again. Monica sat in a hospital bed, staring at her bandaged hands. Her father sat beside her, crying silently. She hadn't seen him cry since her mother's funeral 3 years ago. She reached out, touched his shoulder, and he grabbed her hand like a drowning man grasping a rope. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. "I'm okay," she said. But she wasn't sure if that was true. The Ramirez twins were examined together, refusing to be separated even for medical procedures. Their grandmother arrived and folded them into her arms, speaking rapid Spanish, tears streaming down her weathered face. They held her and finally began to cry. Ed Ray was treated for exhaustion and released. He refused to speak to the press gathered outside the hospital, refused to be called a hero. He'd just done what anyone would do, he said, kept the children alive, gotten them out. But the reporters followed him anyway, cameras flashing, questions shouted. "How did you stay calm? Were you afraid? Did you think you'd survive?" Ed didn't answer, just climbed into a police car and asked to be taken home. The news spread across the country with the speed and force of a tidal wave. 26 children escaped mass kidnapping. Largest kidnapping in its history. Ends in miracle rescue. 3 suspects in custody after elaborate buried van scheme. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Newspapers printed special editions. The story had everything: innocent victims, wealthy villains, a daring escape, a happy ending against impossible odds. President Ford issued a statement praising the courage of Ed Ray and the children. The governor of California announced a full investigation into how such a crime could have been planned without detection. Psychologists appeared on talk shows to discuss the trauma, the recovery, the long-term implications. And in Chowchilla, the small town that had spent 16 hours in hell, people tried to understand what had happened to their community. How 3 men could plan such a thing. How 26 children could be stolen in broad daylight. How close they'd come to losing an entire generation. Chief Stevens stood in front of the abandoned bus on Avenue 21, now surrounded by police tape and evidence markers. News cameras surrounded him. He'd aged 10 years in a single day. "These children showed more courage than any of us could have imagined," he said. His voice was thick. "They survived because they refused to give up, because they worked together, because a bus driver named Ed Ray loved them enough to dig through tons of earth with his bare hands." He paused, swallowed hard, and because somewhere, somehow, someone was watching over them. In the Alameda County Jail, Frederick Woods lay on a concrete bunk, staring at the ceiling. He could hear other inmates talking about him, could hear the disgust in their voices. Even criminals had lines they wouldn't cross. And kidnapping children, burying children alive, that was beyond the pale. He'd thought he was smart, thought he'd planned the perfect crime. $5 million, freedom, a new life. Instead, he had nothing, would have nothing. Would spend the rest of his life, however long that was, in a cage, defined by the worst thing he'd ever done. The children had escaped, had dug themselves out. Something that should have been impossible. Frederick had failed at everything in his life. Now he'd even failed at being a successful criminal. The irony was almost funny. Almost. But as he lay there, listening to the sounds of the jail around him, Frederick felt something he'd never experienced before. Not regret for being caught, not fear of punishment, but genuine horror at what he'd done, at the terror he'd inflicted, at the 26 young lives he'd traumatized for no reason other than his own greed and delusion. It was too late for redemption, too late for forgiveness, too late for anything except the slow, grinding years of incarceration that stretched ahead. But for the first time in his life, Frederick Woods understood what he really was. Not a mastermind, not a criminal genius, just a coward who'd hurt children because he couldn't face his own inadequacy. The realization broke something inside him. He turned his face to the wall and wept. The investigation expanded like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. FBI agents descended on the Woods property in Portola Valley at dawn the morning after the arrests, armed with search warrants that covered every structure, every vehicle, every scrap of paper that might contain evidence. What they found painted a picture of obsessive planning and disturbing entitlement. Agent Parker stood in Frederick's bedroom, cataloging the contents with meticulous care. Notebooks filled with observations of the bus route, dates, times, number of passengers, weather conditions, traffic patterns, sketches of the vans, the buried chamber, the logistics of moving 27 people without being detected, financial calculations showing how $5 million would be divided, invested, used to build new lives in countries without extradition treaties. He thought he was going to get away with it, said Agent Martinez, Parker's partner. She was younger, sharper, with the kind of analytical mind that could piece together a suspect's psychology from the contents of their trash. Look at this. He has plane tickets purchased, fake passports in progress, bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Parker examined a photo on the dresser. Frederick as a teenager, standing beside his father at some construction site. Both men were smiling, but there was something hollow in Frederick's expression. A desperate need for approval that hadn't been satisfied. Money, Parker said. That's what this was about. Not political ideology, not revenge. Just money. Is that supposed to make it better? No, just simpler. The Schoenfeld brothers' stories emerged through separate interrogations conducted simultaneously in different facilities. James showed no remorse. Sat in the interrogation room with his arms crossed, answering questions with the minimum number of words necessary. Yes, he'd helped plan it. Yes, he'd known the children would be terrified. No, he hadn't cared. It was just business. A transaction. Risk versus reward. Did you consider the possibility they might die down there? Parker asked him during one session. James shrugged. We calculated the air supply, the temperature, the provisions. Mathematically, they had 72 hours minimum. Mathematically. What about the heat, the panic, the possibility that your math was wrong? Another shrug. Acceptable risk. Parker wanted to reach across the table and throttle him. Instead, he made notes. Sociopathic tendencies, complete lack of empathy, would make an excellent witness for the prosecution's case about premeditation and depraved indifference. Richard was more complex. He alternated between defiance and collapse, claimed he'd been coerced by his older brother, manipulated by Frederick, pressured by family loyalty. Then, in the next breath, would defend the planning as brilliant, innovative, a crime that should have worked. You want to know the truth? Richard said during one interrogation. His eyes were red. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. I'm glad they escaped. I've been having nightmares, seeing their faces, hearing them crying in the dark. But you did it anyway, Parker said. Yeah, I did it anyway. Why? Richard laughed. It was a broken sound. Because I'm weak. Because I couldn't say no. Because I wanted to prove I was as tough as my brother, as smart as Frederick. Because I'm a goddamn coward. It was the most honest thing any of them had said. The victims began the long process of healing. Chowchilla organized a community meeting at the high school gymnasium 3 days after the children's escape. Folding chairs were set up in rows. Families filled every seat. The air was thick with emotion, relief, anger, residual fear, and a desperate need to understand. A child psychologist from the University of California spoke first. Dr. Ellen Hartley had worked with trauma victims for 20 years, but nothing in her experience compared to this. 26 children, ages 5 to 14, subjected to a 16-hour ordeal of terror, darkness, and near death. These children will carry this with them for the rest of their lives, she said. Her voice was gentle but firm. Some will recover more easily than others. Some will need years of therapy. Some will never fully trust the world again. Your job as parents, as a community, is to create safety, to listen without judgment, to let them process this trauma at their own pace. Rosa Martinez raised her hand. My daughter won't sleep. She keeps the lights on. She checks the locks on every door 10 times before bed. She won't get on any bus, won't go into elevators, won't enter rooms without windows. Is that normal? It's very normal, Dr. Hartley said. She's reasserting control, making sure she can always see escape routes. It's a survival mechanism. It may fade with time, or it may become a permanent part of her personality. Either way, it's not wrong. It's adaptation. Gerald Lewis spoke from the back of the room. His voice was rough. They caught the men who did this. That's supposed to make it better. But my daughter still wakes up screaming, still flinches when I touch her, unexpectedly, still looks at me like she's waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. How do we fix that? You can't, Dr. Hartley said. The honesty was brutal. You can support her, love her, get her professional help, but you can't erase what happened. The best you can do is teach her that most people are good, that terrible things are rare, that she survived something unsurvivable and that makes her stronger than she knows. The gymnasium was silent. Ed Ray tried to return to normal life and found it impossible. He was everywhere, on television, in newspapers. Strangers approached him on the street, wanting to shake his hand, to thank him, to hear the story firsthand. He was invited to speak at schools, at civic organizations, at churches. The mayor gave him a key to the city. The governor presented him with a commendation for heroism. He hated all of it. In his mind, he hadn't been heroic. He'd been terrified, had made decisions out of desperation rather than courage, had gotten lucky that the buried van wasn't deeper, that the dirt wasn't more compacted, that his aging body had held out long enough to dig through to the surface. He sat in his living room, surrounded by plaques and certificates he didn't want, and felt like a fraud. The phone rang. He didn't answer. It was probably another reporter, another request for an interview, another person who wanted him to relive the worst day of his life for their entertainment. The machine picked up. A voice he didn't recognize. Mr. Ray, this is Patricia Ramirez. I'm the grandmother of Carlos and Miguel. I wanted to thank you for bringing them home, for keeping them safe. You don't know me, but I pray for you every night. I want you to know that. The message ended. Ed sat very still. Slowly, he got up, went to his dresser, found the box where he kept letters. There were dozens. From parents, from children, from people across the country who'd heard about what happened and wanted to express their gratitude, their admiration, their awe. He'd read none of them, couldn't bear to. But now, alone in his house, he opened one, then another, and another. Thank you for saving my daughter. You are the reason my son is still alive. You showed us what real courage looks like. Ed read until his vision blurred with tears. Maybe he was a fraud. Maybe he'd just gotten lucky. But to these parents, to these children, he was something else. He was the reason their families were still whole. That had to count for something. The trial was scheduled for early 1977, but legal maneuvering delayed it repeatedly. Frederick's father hired the best defense attorneys money could buy. They filed motions, challenged evidence, requested psychiatric evaluations, argued that Frederick was mentally ill, manipulated by the Schoenfeld brothers, suffering from delusions brought on by prescription medication. The Schoenfeld brothers' attorneys took a different approach. They claimed Frederick was the ringleader, that James and Richard were merely accomplices who'd been coerced into participation. They painted a picture of Frederick as a charismatic sociopath who'd manipulated two simple construction workers into his elaborate scheme. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Buchanan, built an airtight case, physical evidence linking all three men to the crime. The vans, purchased and modified by Frederick. The buried chamber, constructed with materials stolen from Schoenfeld family construction sites. Financial records showing extensive planning. the testimony of the security guard who'd found the children, and most damning, the confessions recorded and transcribed, in which all three described their roles in excruciating detail. But Buchanan knew physical evidence wasn't enough. Not for a crime this heinous. Not for something that had traumatized an entire community. He needed the victims to testify. The question of whether the children should take the stand divided the prosecution team. "They're children," said Assistant DA Helen Torres. "Putting them in a courtroom, making them relive this trauma, facing the men who did this to them, it could cause permanent psychological damage. But their testimony is the most powerful evidence we have," Buchanan countered. "A jury needs to see what these men did, needs to understand the fear, the suffering, the horror of being buried alive. We can prepare them, have counselors present, but we need them." They compromised. Only the older children would testify, those who were psychologically stable enough to handle it, and only with extensive preparation and support. Monica was the first to volunteer. Her father tried to talk her out of it. "You don't have to do this," he said. "The case is strong enough without you." "No, it's not," Monica said. She was 13 now, had lost weight, had nightmares that woke her 3-4 times a night, but her voice was steady. "Someone needs to tell them what it was like, what they did to us, and I can do that." Gerald looked at his daughter and saw someone he barely recognized. The childhood had been burned out of her. What remained was harder, older, scarred. He held her hand. "Okay," he said, "but I'll be there. Every second." "I know," she said. The trial began on March 14, 1977, in the Alameda County Superior Court. The courtroom was packed. Victims' families, media, curious onlookers who'd lined up hours before dawn to get seats. Security was intense. Metal detectors, armed deputies, restricted access. The judge, Harold McIntyre, was known for running a tight courtroom. No outbursts, no theatrics, just facts and law. Frederick, James, and Richard sat at the defense table, flanked by their attorneys. They'd been instructed not to look at the victims or their families, to show appropriate remorse, to appear human. Frederick tried, kept his head down, hands folded, but occasionally his eyes would drift toward the gallery, toward the faces of the children he'd terrorized, and something like recognition would flicker across his features. Buchanan's opening statement was devastating. He spoke for 40 minutes, laying out the timeline, the planning, the execution. He described the buried van in clinical detail, the dimensions, the air supply, the temperature. He showed photographs that made several jurors look away. "These three men," Buchanan said, pointing at the defense table, "decided that 26 children were worth $5 million. That's approximately $192,000 per child. That's what they thought a human life was worth. And when those children were buried underground, terrified, suffocating, dying inch by inch, these men were at home, drinking, sleeping, planning how to spend their money." He paused. Let the words sink in. "The only reason those children are alive today is because they refused to die. Because a 55-year-old bus driver dug through tons of earth with his bare hands. Because children as young as 5 years old held each other in the darkness and prayed for morning. Not because of mercy, not because of conscience, but because victims can sometimes save themselves when their captors won't." The defense couldn't overcome that. Monica took the stand on the third day of testimony. She'd been prepared, had practiced with the prosecutors, knew what questions would be asked. But walking into the courtroom, seeing the three men who'd destroyed her childhood sitting 20 feet away, was different from anything she'd imagined. Her hands shook, her throat was dry. She wanted to run, but she sat down, looked at the prosecutor, nodded that she was ready. "Monica, can you tell the court what happened on July 5th? She took a breath, began to speak. Her voice was quiet at first, hesitant, but as she described the bus ride, the white vans, The men with guns and pantyhose masks. Her voice grew stronger. She told them about the darkness, the heat, the children crying, the certainty that they were going to die. "What did you think when you were in that van?" Buchanan asked gently. "I thought about my mom," Monica said. Tears ran down her face, but her voice didn't waver. "She died when I was 9, cancer. I thought I was going to see her again, that this was it, that I'd never see my dad again, never have a wedding, never have kids, never get to be anything except a girl who died scared and alone in the dark." Several jurors were crying now. "But you didn't die." "No, Mr. Ray. He wouldn't let us give up. He kept saying we were going to make it, that we had to dig. And we believed him. So we dug." "Did the defendants provide adequate air, water, and food?" Monica's eyes finally shifted to the defense table, locked onto Frederick. Her expression was cold. "They gave us water that got hot enough to burn our mouths, bread that turned moldy in the heat, and air that got so thick it felt like drowning. They didn't give us adequate anything. They buried us alive and hoped we'd last long enough for them to get paid." The defense attorney objected. Judge McIntyre sustained it. But the damage was done. One by one, other children testified. The Ramirez twins, speaking through an interpreter, described holding each other in the darkness, certain they'd never see their grandmother again. Jennifer Martinez, now 9 years old, explained how she'd wet herself from fear and couldn't stop apologizing, even though everyone told her it was okay. Ed Ray testified last. His testimony was factual, unemotional, precise. He described the decisions he'd made, the process of digging out, the hours of uncertainty. He didn't embellish, didn't try to make himself sound heroic. "I was responsible for those children," he said simply. "Getting them home was my job. I did my job." When he stepped down, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The defense tried to paint the defendants as victims of circumstance. Frederick's attorney argued diminished capacity, introduced evidence of prescription medication, possible neurological issues, a history of depression, and manic episodes, suggested that Frederick hadn't fully understood the consequences of his action. The Stronfeld brothers' attorney focused on coercion, claimed they'd been manipulated by Frederick's charisma and threatened when they tried to back out. Introduced character witnesses who described them as good men who'd made a terrible mistake. It didn't work. The prosecution had confessions, had physical evidence, had the testimony of 26 traumatized children, had a bus driver who'd literally clawed through earth to save them. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, their faces were grim. "On the count of kidnapping with bodily harm to a minor, how do you find the defendants?" "Guilty. All 3. All 26 counts." The courtroom erupted. Families sobbing with relief. Victims holding each other. Frederick sat motionless, his face blank. James stared at the table. Richard put his head in his hand. Judge McIntyre banged his gavel. "Order. I will have order in this court." Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In California, kidnapping with bodily harm carried a potential sentence of life in prison with possibility of parole. The question was, how much life? The sentencing hearing was brief. Judge McIntyre reviewed the evidence, the testimony, the devastating impact on 26 young lives. He looked at the 3 men standing before him. "I have presided over many trials in my 30 years on the bench," he said. "I have seen terrible crimes, senseless violence, unimaginable cruelty. But this was different. You didn't act in passion. You didn't act in desperation. You planned for months to terrorize children, to bury them alive, to extort money for their safe return. You treated human lives as commodities, and when those children nearly died, when they were suffocating in darkness, you were comfortable in your homes, waiting for a ransom call." He paused. The courtroom was silent. The only reason this isn't a murder trial is because your victims were stronger than you anticipated, because they refused to die for your greed. But make no mistake, you are guilty of attempted murder by deliberate indifference, and you will pay for that. He sentenced each of them to life in prison with possibility of parole after 7 years. The families erupted. 7 years? For what they'd done. 7 years was nothing. But McIntyre's hands were tied by California law. Life with possibility of parole meant the parole board would decide their actual sentence, and he made sure they understood. This is not a minimum sentence, he said. This is a life sentence. Whether you ever walk free is up to the parole board. But if I have any influence, any voice in that process, I will make sure you serve every day you deserve. And gentlemen, you deserve to never see daylight again. Frederick was led away in handcuffs. His face was pale. The reality was finally sinking in. His life was over. At 24 years old, his life was over. James and Richard followed. No last words, no final statements. Just the sound of chains rattling as they shuffled toward prison buses that would take them to separate facilities. The families watched them go. Some felt satisfaction, others felt empty. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the trauma, didn't give back what had been stolen. In the months and years that followed, Chowchilla struggled to heal. Dairyland Elementary installed new security measures, cameras, locked gates, background checks for anyone with access to children. The bus routes were revised. Multiple drivers assigned to popular routes. Police escorts for the first few weeks. But you couldn't security measure away fear. Parents drove their children to school rather than trust the bus. Children developed phobias of enclosed spaces, of darkness, of strangers, of vans. Some families moved away, unable to live in a place that reminded them constantly of what had happened. The 26 victims, scattered across different trajectories. Jennifer Martinez eventually went to therapy, learned coping mechanisms, grew up to become a teacher, working with traumatized children, using her experience to help others. She never forgot what happened, but she didn't let it define her. Monica left Chowchilla after high school, went to college on the East Coast, studied psychology, became a trauma counselor, specializing in kidnapping victims. She wrote a book about her experience 20 years later, used it to fund scholarships for victims of violent crime. The Ramirez twins stayed close to home, worked in their family's business, married local girls, had children of their own. They rarely spoke about what happened, even to each other. But on July 15th every year, they would meet at their grandmother's grave and sit in silence, remembering. Ed Ray continued driving buses for another decade, then retired quietly. He never gave another interview, never sought recognition. When he died in 1998, his obituary mentioned the kidnapping in a single sentence. That's how he would have wanted it. He was buried with full honors. All 26 survivors attended his funeral. The parole hearings began in. Frederick was denied. Then again in 1987 and 1997. Each time, victims and their families attended. Each time, they testified about the ongoing impact, the nightmares, the therapy, the relationships destroyed, the trust shattered. Each time, the parole board said no. James and Richard fared no better. Their applications were denied repeatedly. The crime was too notorious, the victims too sympathetic, the public outcry too intense. Decades passed. The victims became adults, had children of their own, built lives that extended beyond a single day in night. But they never forgot, and they never forgave. In 2015, Frederick's case came up for parole again. He was 63 years old, had spent 39 years in prison. The parole board reviewed his file. He'd been a model prisoner, completed multiple education programs, expressed remorse in every hearing. But across the state, Former victims mobilized, wrote letters, gave interviews, attended the hearing. Monica was there. Now 51 years old, a successful therapist with a family and a career built on helping others heal from trauma. She stood before the parole board and spoke. "I'm supposed to tell you that I've forgiven him," she said. "That's what people expect from victims. Forgiveness. Moving on. But I haven't forgiven him, and I never will. What he did to me, to us, wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice to terrorize children for money. And while I've built a good life, while I've found ways to cope, I still wake up sometimes unable to breathe, trapped in darkness, 8 years old again, and certain I'm going to die. That's his legacy. That's what he gave me. So no, I don't think he should be released. I don't think he's paid enough. And I don't think any amount of time will ever be enough." The parole board deliberated, then denied his release. Frederick returned to his cell. He would try again in a few years, and probably be denied again. The cycle would continue until either he died or public memory faded enough that the parole board could release him without political consequences. But for now, justice held. By 2020, the story had become history. Textbooks mentioned it in chapters about crimes of the 1970s. True crime documentaries featured it with dramatic reenactments and interviews with aging survivors. Podcasts dissected every detail, with the clinical detachment that comes from temporal distance. A new generation learned about the Chowchilla kidnapping the way previous generations had learned about the Lindbergh baby. As a cautionary tale, a moment when innocence was shattered. A reminder that evil could wear ordinary faces and strike without warning. Jennifer Martinez, now a 54-year-old elementary school principal, sometimes gave talks to her students about resilience. She never mentioned her own experience unless pressed, but occasionally a perceptive child would research her name, find the old news articles and come to her office with questions. "Is it true?" they'd ask. "Were you really kidnapped?" And Jennifer would nod, would tell them a simplified version, would explain that terrible things sometimes happen to good people, but that survival is possible, that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story, that you can be broken and still put yourself back together, even if the cracks always show. "Do you still have nightmares?" one child asked. Jennifer considered lying, considered giving the inspirational answer about overcoming and healing and triumph. But she respected children too much for that. "Yes," she said, "sometimes, but they're less frequent now. And when they come, I remind myself that I survived, that I'm here, that the men who hurt me are in cages, and I'm free. That helps." The child nodded, seemed satisfied with the honesty. Jennifer watched them leave. Thought about that July afternoon 44 years ago. The yellow dress with flowers that her mother had worried she'd ruin. The drawing she'd been so proud of, left crumpled on a bus floor. The darkness, the heat, the certainty of death. And then the miracle of stars, of air, of survival against impossible odds. She'd lived a full life since then. Graduated college, married, divorced, raised 2 children, who knew their mother was strong because she'd been tested in ways most people couldn't imagine, found purpose in education, in helping shape young minds, in creating safe spaces where children could learn and grow without fear. The kidnapping was part of her story, but it wasn't all of her story. That was what the 3 men in prison had never understood. They'd thought they could reduce 26 children to dollar signs, to obstacles, to means to an end. But those children had been whole people with futures stretching ahead, like unopened roads, and they'd remained whole people, even after being buried alive. Frederick and James and Richard had stolen 16 hours, but they hadn't stolen everything. That was the real failure of their plan. Not that they'd been caught, but that even when they'd succeeded, even when they'd accomplished the kidnapping, buried the children, set the stage for their ransom, they'd still lost. Because the victims had won. Monica received a letter in February. The return address was California State Prison, Corcoran. No name, just a prisoner number. She almost threw it away without opening it. She knew who it was from. Who else would be writing her from that particular facility? But curiosity won. She opened it. The handwriting was careful, neat. The hand of someone who'd spent decades with little to do but practice forming letters. Dear Ms. Lewis, I know you won't want to read this. I know you probably hate me. You have every right to. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve that, and I wouldn't expect it. I'm writing because I'm dying. Lung cancer. Stage 4. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, and I wanted to tell you, before I go, that I'm sorry. I know sorry isn't enough. No, it doesn't change anything. But I need to say it anyway. What I did to you and the others was unforgivable. I knew it was wrong at the time. I knew you were children. I knew you were terrified. I did it anyway because I was selfish and greedy and convinced myself that money was more important than human life. I've had 46 years to think about it, to understand what I did, to see your faces in my dreams, all of you, but especially you, because you were the one who looked at me in court like you could see exactly what I was. A coward, a monster, someone who hurt children, because I couldn't face my own failures. You've probably built a good life. I hope you have. You deserve happiness. All of you do. And I'm sorry that I'm part of your story. Sorry that when you think about your childhood, there's this black hole where innocence should be. Sorry that I took something from you that can never be given back. I'm not asking you to write back. Not asking for anything. Just wanted you to know that I've thought about you every day for 46 years. That I'm sorry, and that I hope, somehow, you've found peace. Frederick Woods. Monica read it twice, then put it down on her desk and stared at it for a long time. Her first instinct was anger. How dare he? How dare he reach out now when he was dying, seeking some kind of absolution or closure? How dare he think his apology mattered after all this time? But beneath the anger was something else, something unexpected. Pity. Frederick Woods had spent 46 years in prison, would die there, had no legacy except the terrible thing he'd done. No children, no achievements, no life beyond the crime that had defined him. While Monica had 2 adult children, 3 grandchildren, a successful practice, patients she'd helped, a husband who loved her, despite the nightmares and the panic attacks, and the 1,000 small ways trauma had shaped her personality. She'd won, not because the justice system had punished Frederick, but because she'd refused to let that single day define her entire existence. She picked up a pen, wrote a single sentence on a piece of paper. I hope you find peace too. She addressed an envelope, sealed it, mailed it that afternoon. She never heard from Frederick again. 5 months later, she saw his obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle. Frederick Newhall Woods III, 70, dies in prison. 3 paragraphs summarizing his life, wealthy family, the kidnapping, decades of incarceration. Nothing else. No other accomplishments. No other identity. Just the crime. Monica cut out the obituary, put it in a folder with other mementos from that period of her life. Newspaper clippings, therapy notes, photos of her younger self, trying to look normal despite the weight she carried. Then she closed the folder, put it back in the filing cabinet, and went to work. She had patients waiting, people who needed help processing their own traumas, children who'd been through things no child should experience, adults still haunted by events from decades ago. She could help them. Not by offering easy answers or false promises of complete healing, but by showing them what survival looked like, by being living proof that trauma could be carried without destroying you, that you could be marked and still be whole. That was her victory, her revenge, if such a thing existed. She'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and transformed it into the foundation for helping others. Frederick had taken his privilege, his intelligence, his resources, and built a tomb. The difference told you everything you needed to know about who they really were. The last parole hearing for James Schoenfeld took place in March. He was 73 years old, had served 48 years. His brother Richard had died in prison in 2021. A heart attack, sudden, at age 67. Frederick had been gone for 2 years. James was the last one left. The hearing room was less crowded than previous ones. Time had winnowed the survivors. Some had moved too far away to attend. Others had decided they'd given enough of their lives to this story. A few had passed away. Ed Ray in 1998, Jennifer Martinez in 2019 from breast cancer, 3 others from various causes. But Monica was there, always there. She'd promised herself she'd attend every hearing until either they were all dead or she was. James looked old, frail. His beard was white. His hands shook. He shuffled into the room in chains, moving like a man decades older than his years. The parole board reviewed his file. Model prisoner, educational achievements, therapy, remorse. All the boxes checked. Mr. Schoenfeld, the board chair said, "This is your 14th parole hearing. You've consistently expressed remorse. Your behavior has been exemplary. Your psychological evaluations suggest you're not a danger to society. Why should we release you now?" James was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough, tired. "I don't know that you should," he said. "I've been in here almost 50 years. I'm 73 years old. If you release me, I'll probably be dead within a few years anyway, and I'll die knowing I destroyed lives, terrorized children, caused pain that still echoes decades later. That's not something you recover from, not something that deserves forgiveness." He looked at Monica, directly at her for the first time since entering the room. "I see you're here again," he said. "You've been at every hearing. Why?" Monica hadn't expected to be addressed directly. She paused, then spoke. "Because someone needs to remember. Because the world moves on and people forget and crimes become statistics. But I remember what it felt like to be 13 years old and buried alive. I remember thinking I was going to die. I remember the darkness and the heat and the absolute certainty that I'd never see my father again. And I need you to see that every time you ask to be freed. Need you to look at me and remember what you did. Need the parole board to see that the consequences of your choices didn't end when you were arrested. They're still ongoing, still reverberating, still destroying parts of me I'm trying to keep intact." James nodded slowly. "I understand. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I've been sorry every day for 48 years. But sorry doesn't fix anything, does it?" "No," Monica said. "It doesn't." The parole board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, their decision was split. 3 members voted for release. He'd served his time, shown remorse, was unlikely to reoffend given his age and health. 4 members voted against. The crime was too severe. The victim still suffering. The message of releasing him would be wrong. James was denied parole, would be eligible again in 3 years. But at 76, with declining health, nobody expected him to live that long. He shuffled out of the room in his chains. Didn't look back. Monica watched him go. Felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Just a deep, bone-tired exhaustion. How many more times would she do this? How many more hearings? How many more years of reliving the worst day of her life for an audience of strangers? She was 60 years old, had grandchildren who needed her attention, a husband who worried about the toll these hearings took, a practice that suffered when she took time off to attend parole boards. Maybe it was time to let go, to stop coming, to trust that justice would run its course without her constant vigilance. But even as she thought it, Monica knew she wouldn't stop, couldn't stop, because someone needed to remember. Someone needed to be the voice for the children they'd been. For Ed Ray, who died without seeking glory. For Jennifer, who'd survived the kidnapping only to lose her battle with cancer. For all the others who'd been marked by that day and carried the scars into every tomorrow. She would keep coming, keep testifying, keep remembering, until she couldn't anymore. The 50th anniversary fell on July 5th. Chowchilla organized a memorial ceremony. Not a celebration. What was there to celebrate? But an acknowledgement, a marking of time, a statement that the town hadn't forgotten. They held it at Dairyland Elementary, which had been rebuilt in 1985 but still occupied the same plot of land. A monument had been erected in 2001, a simple stone pillar with 26 names carved into it. Ed Ray's name was at the top. Below, the children listed alphabetically. The surviving victims were invited. 17 of them came. 9 had passed away over the decades. The youngest was now 55. The oldest, 64. They'd lived full lives, or as full as lives could be with trauma woven into their foundations. They gathered around the monument in the evening, as the sun set over the almond orchards that still surrounded the town. The heat was familiar, oppressive, the same quality of California summer that had pressed down on them 50 years ago. Monica stood beside Carlos Ramirez, now 60 years old, a grandfather, a man who still had nightmares but had learned to function despite them. His twin brother Miguel had died in a car accident, and Carlos said he felt him sometimes, especially on July 15th, as if some part of their shared experience kept them connected even after death. 50 years, Carlos said softly. Half a century. Seems like yesterday sometimes, Monica said. Other times it feels like it happened to a different person. Both can be true. They stood in silence as the town mayor spoke, thanked them for their resilience, praised their courage, called them heroes. The words rang hollow. They'd heard versions of the same speech dozens of times. Victims weren't heroes. They were just people who'd survived something they shouldn't have had to survive. But Monica understood the need. The town needed to believe that something good had come from the tragedy, that the victims had transcended their trauma, that evil had been defeated by innocence and determination. It wasn't true, not entirely. Evil had left scars that never fully healed. Innocence had been murdered that day, even if the children had lived. But let them believe. Let them have their narrative of redemption and survival. It hurt nothing and helped some. After the ceremony, the survivors gathered privately, away from cameras, away from well-meaning citizens who wanted to shake their hands and tell them how inspiring they were. They sat in a circle, these 17 people bound by a shared nightmare, and talked. Not about the kidnapping. They'd talked enough about that. For 50 years, they'd talked about it to therapists, to investigators, to journalists, to their families. Instead, they talked about their lives, about grandchildren and retirements and health problems and small victories, about gardens and recipes and vacations and all the ordinary precious things that filled the space between trauma and death. They laughed, cried, held each other with the fierce affection of people who'd survived hell together. And as the evening deepened into night, as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars they'd seen 50 years ago when they'd clawed their way out of the earth, Monica felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. Not complete peace. Not the absence of pain, or memory, or loss, but the peace that comes from having survived, from having built something despite everything, from having refused to let 3 greedy, cowardly men define her existence. She'd been buried alive at 13, and she'd spent the next 50 years digging herself out in 1,000 different ways, through therapy and education, and helping others and showing up to parole hearings, and refusing, always refusing to let the darkness win. She was 63 years old, had lived long enough to see her kidnappers die in prison, had outlived some of her fellow survivors, had built a legacy that extended far beyond a single day of terror. That was victory. Not the legal kind, not the kind that came from sentencing and parole denials, but the kind that mattered. The kind that said, "You tried to destroy me. You failed." James Schoenfeld died in prison on November 3, 2026, 4 months after the 50th anniversary. Pneumonia, complicated by age and decades of incarceration. He was 75 years old, had spent 49 years behind bars, would have been eligible for parole again in 2027, but death came first. His obituary was brief, mentioned the crime, noted his death. Nothing else. Monica saw it in the paper, felt nothing, checked it off mentally. All three now dead. Frederick in 2022, Richard in 2020. The men who'd terrorized her were gone, had died in cages, carrying the weight of what they'd done. She didn't celebrate, didn't feel closure, didn't experience the catharsis that popular culture promised victims when their tormentors died. She just felt tired and old and ready to stop fighting. She called her husband, told him she wasn't going to any more hearings, wasn't giving any more interviews, wasn't participating in any more documentaries or anniversary ceremonies or anything else related to the kidnapping. "I'm done," she said. "I've spent 50 years of my life defined by what happened when I was 13. I want to spend however many years I have left being something else. Someone else. Just Monica. Just me." "Okay," he said. "Whatever you need." She hung up, sat in her office, looking at the framed photos on her desk. Her children, her grandchildren, her husband. The people who knew her not as a victim or a survivor or an inspiration, but as a woman with flaws and strengths, and a past that shaped her but didn't consume her. That's who she wanted to be. For whatever time remained, the story of the Chowchilla kidnapping lived on. Books were written, podcasts produced, documentaries filmed. Each new generation discovered it and marveled at the audacity of the crime, the miracle of the escape, the justice of the convictions. It became legend, myth, a cautionary tale told to teach lessons about evil and resilience, about the darkness humans are capable of and the light that sometimes pushes back. But for the survivors, it was simpler and more complicated than that. It was a day, one terrible day that bled into 16 hours that felt like eternity. A day that changed everything and nothing, that killed part of them and forced other parts to grow stronger, that taught them about fear and survival and the strange arithmetic of trauma, where horror plus time doesn't equal healing but rather transformation. They carried it, all of them, until death claimed them one by one, taking with it the first-hand memory of what it felt like to be buried alive, to believe death was certain, to claw through earth toward the impossible hope of stars. Eventually, the last survivor would die, and then the kidnapping would exist only in archives and articles and the collective memory of a nation that moved from tragedy to tragedy, always remembering, never quite understanding. But for now, 17 people lived with the knowledge that they'd survived the unsurvivable, that they'd been reduced to commodities, to obstacles, to means to an end, and had refused to accept that definition. They'd dug themselves out of hell, had lived full lives in the shadow of trauma, had proved that victims could be more than their victimhood, that terror could be outlived, that 3 men with guns and pantyhose masks and delusions of criminal genius could steal 16 hours but not everything. That was the real story. Not the kidnapping itself, but what came after. The decades of nightmares and therapy, the marriages and divorces, the children raised and careers built, the ordinary, miraculous fact of continuing to exist, to wake up and eat breakfast and go to work and love people and hurt and heal and breathe. They'd been buried, and they'd refused to stay buried. That was all, and it was everything. On July 15, 2036, the 60th anniversary, there were no ceremonies. Only 12 survivors remained. They were scattered across the country, living quiet lives, connected by occasional emails and phone calls, but no longer feeling the need to gather and commemorate. Monica was 73 years old, retired, living in Oregon with her husband. Her grandchildren visited often. She gardened, read, volunteered at a local women's shelter, helping victims of domestic violence find their footing. She didn't mention the kidnapping unless directly asked. It was part of her history, but no longer the defining chapter. She'd written other chapters, better ones. Chapters about love and work and the small, persistent victories of ordinary life. On the morning of July 15th, she woke early, made coffee, sat on her porch as the sun rose, watching the mist burn off the trees beyond her property line. She thought about Ed Ray, about Jennifer, about all the others who'd been on that bus, the ones who'd survived and the ones who'd since passed on. She thought about being 13 years old, wearing her cousin's hand-me-down t-shirt, drawing in the margins of her notebook, believing the world was predictable and safe. She thought about darkness, about heat, about the certainty of death. And then she thought about stars, about the impossible moment when Ed Ray's hands broke through to the surface and night air flooded in, cool and sweet and tasting of survival. 60 years ago, an entire lifetime. And yet, in some ways, it was still yesterday. Would always be yesterday. That's how trauma worked. It collapsed time, made the past and present exist simultaneously, left you standing in two places at once. But Monica had learned to live with that, had learned that you could be haunted and still be happy, could carry scars and still be whole, could remember horror and still choose joy. She finished her coffee, went inside, kissed her husband as he stumbled sleepily toward the kitchen. "You okay?" he asked. He always asked on July 5th. "Yeah," she said, and meant it. "I'm okay." Because she was. Not undamaged, not unmarked, but okay, alive, free. 60 years removed from the grave 3 men had dug for her. And that, in the end, was enough. The story ended not with justice or revenge or perfect healing, but with something simpler and more profound, with continuing to exist, despite everything, with waking up another morning, with choosing, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, to keep living. That was the victory. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just persistent and quiet and real. The men who'd buried 26 children were dead and forgotten. The children they'd tried to destroy had grown up, grown old, and kept going. In that arithmetic lay the only justice that truly mattered.